everyone, and thank you for joining us. I hope you are all ready to learn about automation keys, what they are, why, and how you can use them in FME Server. So my name is Holly Coxon, and I'm an FME Server technical support specialist, and I've been in this role with Safe Software for just over 3 years now. And today I'm going to be joined by Mark Warren, who I'll let introduce himself as well.
Hi everyone, so I'm Mark and I am also an FME Server technical support specialist, and I've been with Safe for just over a year.
Perfect, thanks Mark. So I think at this point what we're going to do is turn our cameras off and then we'll get started. Okay, so first up I want to just walk you through what you can expect from today's webinar. So I'm going to start off by introducing the concept of keys in automations and by providing definitions on the different key types and why you might want to use them. And then for the remainder of this session, both Mark and I will be walking you through a demonstration where we build an automation step by step using a number of these different key types. And as part of this demo, we'll also be making use of the split merge block, which is a new feature in FME Server 2021.1. So if you have any questions throughout the webinar, then please use the chat feature. We have additional FME Server experts, Laura and Sinai, behind the scenes ready to answer any of your questions. And at the end of the webinar, there'll also be a chance to answer questions live. And if time permits, we'll read out some of the questions that were asked throughout as well. So before we dive into the topic of automation keys, I'd like to quickly gauge what experience those of you who have tuned in have with FME Server automations. So I'll ask Elizabeth to send out this poll now. And the answers range from having never used FME Server to how much you've used automations within FME Server. So if you don't feel like you fit comfortably into one of these categories, then you can send your response to our chat as well. And I'll just give it another minute for you all to submit your responses. Okay, I think we've had most people submit responses at this point. So Elizabeth, we can probably wrap up the poll now. Okay, perfect. So it looks like we targeted the right audience here, as we have probably about half of you either not used FME Server, but using FME Server and not automations. And then the other half of you have created basic automation workflows. So the one thing I will note is if you are new to FME Server entirely or have not used FME Server automations, then I would definitely recommend that on top of this webinar, you check out the Getting Started with Automation tutorial series to help you make the most of the information that we provide you with today. So Elizabeth will send that link in the chat now. Yeah, because we're going to be introducing the concept of automation keys, which is a small element that allows you to build out these more complex automations. Okay. So firstly, why automation? Automating your tasks has some major benefits. And to name just a few, it saves businesses time, money. It can help break down data silos as you integrate applications. It can help improve data quality and so much more as well. So in FME Server, you can automate your workflow using a feature named automations. And in order to build automations, you will have to make use of keys. So automations themselves allow you to build enterprise integration workflows. FME Server can receive messages and they are stored in a JSON format from external events. and then they can trigger workspaces to be run in real time, processing the information that is stored in these messages. So an automation key is what can be used to pass this information through the different automation components. The JSON is flattened and the key value pairs are stored in these automation keys. So next I'm going to break down the 4 different key types and why you might choose to use them. So there are a number of different key types in automations. Output keys are keys that are available to use from a port on an automation component, whose values are defined at runtime based on the incoming event. So output keys can be categorized into 3 types of key: event, user, and automation writer keys. So first we have event keys. And these are predefined output keys specific to the trigger, internal, or external action type. So for example, FME Server is capable of watching the contents of a directory. If it triggered, the JSON message received by FME Server contains the change that took place. So we'll record whether a file was created, modified, or deleted within that directory. And we'll also record the file path and the file root name. So the file path, the root name, and the change that took place are the information that's passed in the JSON message. And this is flattened out to make the event keys specific to the directory watch trigger. So event keys can be inserted downstream within an automation to process the value in real time. So sticking with the directory watch example, what this means is the file path can be used as the source dataset in a workspace, allowing data to be fetched and processed immediately whenever it is uploaded without any manual intervention. So the second type of output key is a user key. And these can be defined by the user who is building the automation, and they can be set to take a value from an existing event key, or they can be a manual text entry. So there are a number of scenarios where creating a user key in your automation might be helpful. Firstly, if the same action is present more than once in a workflow, event keys have the same names getting myself twisted. So if the same action is present more than once in a workflow, then because the event keys have the same name across the different components, the upstream values will be overwritten. So to better explain that, if you can imagine you have 2 run workspace actions in sequence, only the second job ID will be stored in the final output JSON message. So to work around this, you can create a user key to give the first workspace job ID key a unique name, so these values both remain accessible. Second, you may wish to set one downstream parameter to use the value of multiple different upstream keys. For example, perhaps in addition to your directory watch trigger, you have an email trigger. So FME Server is monitoring an existing email account and looking for new emails. And you would like to process files that have either been uploaded to a directory or attached to an email. So in that case, the event key names differ. From the directory watch, it's called a file path, and from the email, it's called email attachment. So you can create a user key with a common name shared between the 2 trigger types to be assigned to the workspace action downstream. So this is just a few examples of why you might want to use user keys in your workflows. If you have already made use of automations, and there is another reason why you've used any of the key types that we talk about today, then please share that in the chat as well, and we'll try and give you a shout out at the end of the webinar. Okay, so the final type of output key are keys that exist only from a run workspace action when an automation writer is present in the workspace. So these allow you to pass attribute values out of a workspace into a downstream automation action, enabling you to orchestrate data-driven workflows and trigger any number of additional processes. So the final key type is different from those that I have shared so far, as they do not fall into the output key category. Instead, we have global keys, and these are user-defined keys set at the automation rather than component level. This means that the value they hold is not dependent on the event at runtime, and global parameters can be referenced throughout the entire automation. So they can be particularly helpful in your workflow in reducing maintenance efforts. For example, perhaps you have multiple workspaces referencing the same output file, or you are sending multiple emails at different points in your automation to the same list of recipients. And rather than setting this on each individual component, you can point to a global key, which makes any updates much easier because you only have to change the value once, and that's reflected across many different components in your automation workflow. So overall, making use of keys in your automation is going to give you the power to create dynamic workflows that process changing input values. So let's move on to our demo where we can actually use some of these keys in action. So in the following demonstration, we're going to be using a scenario that some of you may have come across before in other knowledge resources. The idea is that we will be taking a US state and breaking it down into counties and blocks for additional processing by spinning up additional jobs. And then once all of these workspaces are complete, we'll be looking to send an email. So the main purpose of this demonstration is that for a successful result, we need to incorporate a variety of the different key types to pass information between components. So it's the perfect example for today's webinar topic. So step one is to set up the trigger. So in this automation, we would like to be able to run a chain of workspaces on demand and provide the state name to be processed at runtime. And this can be achieved using the manual trigger, which was new to FME Server in 2021.0. So the manual trigger can be set up to prompt for a JSON message when the automation is kicked off. And so unlike the other triggers, the manual trigger does not have a predefined event keys because FME does not know beforehand what the information in the incoming message may contain. So when we use this trigger, the automation creator must define the event keys based on a sample JSON message in order to be able to use these values. So in this example, we're going to be entering the state. And so the JSON string on this slide is the information we'll be entering into the manual trigger. And the state is what's going to become the automation writer key name. And then the value is what is going to be used in any downstream actions. So for this demo, it's going to be Hawaii, but we could change it to California or any other US state. And then that will be what is processed in the further workspace actions. So once the trigger is all set up, then we can add in our workspaces. So in this demonstration, the workspaces contain an automation writer. And the automation writer is going to add an additional output port and pass one message and associated attribute into the automation for every feature that it receives. So I'm going to step out of the presentation in a moment and actually show how we can set this up in FME Server. But one tip that I'd like you to take away as you're watching this is that since keys are designed to pass information downstream, your workspace actions must contain published parameters in order to accept the key data as inputs. So in certain cases, you might have to build your workflow slightly differently in a way to use these published parameters. So by making use of the parameter fetcher transformer to grab this key data before working with it. Okay, so let's dive into FME Server. So I'll start on the home page, just for those of you that are not familiar with FME Server. FME Server is an application that allows you to publish workspaces up from FME Desktop and set them to run based on various other events that are happening. So this is the FME Server homepage. And if you have used FME Server before, then you might notice there are some interface changes from the last versions. But you should still have access to the automations functionality. So on the left-hand side, we have a list of all of the different functionality that's available within the FME Server interface. And so for this demo, we'd like to build an automation. So I'm going to select Automation, Build Automation. And when you first get into automations, you'll be presented with this Get Started pop-up. And so for this demo, I'm just going to close that down. And I'm going to be presented with a trigger that's already on my canvas. So as I start to build my automation, you might notice it has a similar look to FME Desktop in that you have a series of different nodes that you add onto a canvas. And then they all have a set of parameters that require configuration. So all of your automations will have to start with a trigger because this is what FME Server needs to know what to look for in order to run any downstream actions. So I'm going to click on my trigger and set it to the manual trigger event. And for the manual trigger, there's only one parameter that requires configuration, and it's simply a checkbox as to whether you'd like to prompt for JSON when you do trigger the automation. So depending on your workflow, you might just want to run an automation, but there's no additional input required. But in this case, we're going to provide the state value. So we want to keep this box checked. And then the next thing that we need to do is define that manual event key. So we can go over to the output keys. And then we have the option to either import key from JSON. And this can be helpful if you're planning on entering a large string of JSON into your input, because FME will pass the values into keys for you. But in this case, I only have one key in my JSON, which is the state. So I can just manually enter it through here as well. So I'm going to apply this, and you'll see that my trigger gets updated to show that it is now a manual trigger type. And so after my trigger, I then want to set up my run workspace actions. So to do that, I'm going to select the plus icon in the bottom left corner, and I'm going to select the orange action, which represents any internal actions on FME Server. So most commonly, this is running a workspace, but we also have the option to filter messages and log messages as well. So I'm simply going to drag and drop that onto the canvas, and I'm going to select the action succeeded port and connect it to my run workspace. So now I'm going to configure my first run workspace, which is to process the state value. So once I select my workspace, you're going to see a list of any published parameters in the bottom here. So in this workspace, I have one published parameter for the state, And it will show any value that was in the parameter when it was published to FME Server. So by default, this is going to be California. But instead, I want to actually use the value from my upstream manual key. So I can select this icon, select manual keys, and I can find my state key that I created. So now what's going to happen is every time I trigger this automation, whatever state value I enter will be the one that's used in this workspace. So once I select OK, you'll notice that there's an additional output port that's been added to my Run Workspace action. So usually this would simply have a translation success or a translation failed port. But in my case, my workspace, my process state workspace, contains an automation writer. So let's quickly go over to FME Workbench to show how this is set up. So hopefully this is large enough that everybody can see it. I have a fairly straightforward workspace here. I'm simply using a creator to kickstart my workspace. And then I'm using a parameter fetcher transformer to bring my state value out into an attribute. And from there, I'm using a database joiner, and I simply have a CSV dataset that's listing all of the US counties. And so I'm merging my state attribute that I entered through the manual trigger with the state name within this CSV file to read out the county. And so then at that point, what I'm going to be doing is passing that county name into my automation writer. And so this county is the name of the feature type, and that's what's going to match the value that you can see on that additional output port in the automation. And then any attributes that are sent into the automation writer will now be available to use in any downstream actions. And so the other thing that you'll notice here is that I have 5 counties in the state of Hawaii. So for every feature that reaches this automation writer, it's going to submit that feature through my automation. So I'm going to head back over to FME Server, and now I'm going to add an additional Run Workspace action onto this county output port. And this time I'm going to process the county. And this time I'm going to be using that automation writer key from my workspace. So I can find the county and find the name. So now when I select OK, I've had my second workspace configured. And I'm going to repeat this process one more time. In this workflow, we're dividing the counties up even further into blocks. And this is just to reduce the amount of data that needs to be processed per workspace so that we can run our workspaces in parallel and they'll be completed quicker. So what's going to happen in this workflow is that I'm going to use my manual trigger to submit my state name. And then this workspace is going to submit that state, which in this demo is going to be Hawaii, and identify 5 counties. So we're going to submit 5 different features out of this output port, hence submitting 5 process county workflows, 1 for each of the county values. These counties are then going to be divided up even further into blocks, and there's going to be 10 blocks per county, which means that I'm actually going to be triggering 50 process block workspaces. So in total from my manual trigger, I'll be submitting 56 workspaces from this event. So at this point, I'm going to save my automation, ready for Mark to take over for the second part of this demonstration. So now we're going to head back over to the presentation. And before we transition, I'm going to do a quick poll. So So because we're submitting 56 workspaces, we now have a challenge, which is that we only want to submit one email once the entire automation is complete. But right now there's going to be 50 emails coming out of the successful block output port. So I'm going to ask Elizabeth to share a quick poll to see if you can guess what action we're going to use to consolidate all of these workspace messages. Okay, I think we've got about half the audience having submitted votes, so we can probably move on and reveal the answer.
All right, and thanks, Holly. So now for the answer, we're all looking at the poll and the results coming in. So it looks like the top answer was the merge action, and coming in second place was the split merge block. So when it comes to the answer to this question, let's say you want to perform one action when all the jobs in your automation are complete, like running a certain workspace or sending an email. If you're thinking about the merge action, that can't be accomplished with our goal because in our demo, we're using the automation writer, and the merge action actually cannot be used with workflows that use the automation writer. However, we can use the new split merge block, which is compatible with the automation writer outputs. So the split merge block makes us rethink how automations and keys are handled. For those who are new to this, just take a look at the screenshot on your right. It's like a bookmark that contains workspaces and changes how your automation behaves. Regardless of the number of jobs run inside the split merge block, it will output one message per input and only contain information for the final job run in the block. For an in-depth tutorial on the split merge block, we highly recommend reading the Job Orchestration with Automations article on the FME community. We'll be sharing that link with you in the chat right now. So when automation writers are used to run downstream workspaces, these job requests can vastly increase based on the number of output features from the preceding workspace. So let's imagine we didn't have the split merge block in this example. The automation starts with an event trigger that generates one key, which then runs those downstream workspaces. If process state outputs 10 counties and process county outputs 20 blocks per county, that means process block at the very end is going to be running 200 times. And if we try to add an email action without the split merge block, we'd be sending 200 emails. And that's definitely not what we want. But by containing these workspaces in the block, there will only be one output message. So the big question, what does the split merge block have to do with keys? We're using attribute enriched keys from automation writers to control dozens of job requests while not compromising downstream actions. The split merge block opens new opportunities for large and complex workflows built on keys and automation writers. And the next step in our demo will involve global keys. So instead of manually entering our repetitive parameter values and our automation actions, we're just going to use global keys instead. So global keys are fantastic for reusable values since they can be used all across an automation, and the key value is managed in a single location, which is the global key editor as shown in the bottom left screenshot. For anyone who's done programming before, just think of the global key as a global variable. And any parameter value that's used in multiple places is a perfect candidate for a global key, such as email recipients and file paths. That way, instead of editing every value across your automation, you just have to update that one global key and you're done. So an extra bit of customization we're going to add to our demo is by using the text editor with our keys, because with this function, you can add multiple keys in a single parameter value. And this can be incredibly useful for concatenating key values or creating custom text bodies. When selecting output keys for parameters, you can use the text editor to select and format the output as you wish. And in this example on the screenshot on the bottom, we're customizing our email subject or body with event keys such as the job status, the time finished, and the state that we're processing based on the manual trigger. And with the setup, we'll be receiving descriptive and dynamic emails based on key values. So now we're going to jump into the second part of the demo, and I'll be picking up from where Holly left off. So the problem, as described, is that we have process block at the end that will run 50 times, and we want to be just receiving one email at the very end. So the solution to this is the split merge block, which can be found in the component menu on the bottom left. And you'll see the gray button here is our split merge block. I'm just going to add that to my canvas. And you'll see that it looks just like a bookmark. It's like a rectangle that you can expand and contract. And in this, I want to contain the workspaces that I want to run and receive only one output at the very end. So now I'm just going to connect the manual trigger to the input of the split merge block so that when the manual trigger runs, it's going to run all the workspaces inside. And then when the final job and process block is done, then I want to receive that one successful event message. And if anything fails in here or in the process block workspace, I'd want to receive a single failure message as well. If I want to receive that failure message from process county or process state, I can also connect those action failed ports to the split merge block failure port. But just for the sake of simplicity of this demo, I'm not going to be doing that. So at this point, we have our automation that's ready to go, and that it will send one event message at the very end. But I want to perform those downstream actions. So let's say I want to run an a workspace in response to that final job run of process block. So I can go here and select my downstream work that I want to run. And then I also want to receive that email notification. So I'm just going to paste it onto the canvas. I've already configured this in the background, and I'm just pasting it in just so you don't have to watch me set up this email action. But just looking inside, we've set up a connection to our email server, and we want to be sending an email to ourselves that's notifying us that the entire automation has completed successfully. And as we talked about in the demonstration with keys that can be added in the text editor for the email subject or email body, you can see here that we have the FME Server automation finished processing and state. So that state is our key, and we are just entering that into our text box by looking through the different keys that we have access to in the menu on the side. And likewise, we are doing the same customization to our email body. And in this case, we are just notifying the user of which state we've finished processing, the time that that final job finished, as well as the job status. And similarly, I want to receive that failure email if anything fails, let's say whether it's the downstream work or our workspace, anything inside our split merge block. We can just connect those to our email action, and then we'd receive that failure email. So I just need to customize the subject. So I can just say that it failed processing the state, and I can just do that in the subject and the body. So a quick tip when it comes to customizing your email body or subject or whatever key or parameter that you're using your keys in, you have the ability to see all the keys that you have access to by going over to your output keys, and at the bottom you'll see show upstream keys. You can turn that on and you'll notice that event keys has jumped up from 2 to 18. You can see all those keys that are coming from upstream and that this action has access to. So that's a good central place to look at all the information that's coming into this action that you can use. So now that we've set up our email actions and our downstream work, we also want to customize our email to or email recipients. So if I wanted to add extra recipients to these email actions, I don't want to have to edit both of these emails. So what I can do instead is that I can just go and create a global key from this email to parameter. And now you'll see that it's changed and that it has become a global key that I can find up in the global keys editor. And that if I want to change and add an extra email address, I can do that just from this location. And then when going into my failure email, I just need to go to the recipients, open up my keys menu, and you'll see that now we have that global key that we can add. So now if I ever want to change those recipients, I just need to do it once, and I don't have to go across all my email actions and change it all the way. And that saves a lot of time, and it also reduces the risk of error. So now our automation is complete and ready to run. So we now can demonstrate this automation running, and I can just start it. And as mentioned with the manual trigger, we will be prompted for a JSON. So I'm just going to quickly enter in the state of Hawaii that we want to process. And the automation has been successfully triggered. And just to keep an eye on what is happening right now, we're going to go into the triggered jobs. And everything's completed, but we'll just scroll down to the very bottom just to see and walk through what happened. So our manual trigger set off the process state workspace, which then ran the 5 counties in that state. So we have our 5 processed county jobs that run, and then our 50 process block workspaces that all run. And you can see you just need to scroll up, and when everything's done, then it leaves the split merge block with that single event key, and we're running the downstream workspace just once. And then I can open up my email inbox just so we can see that email that we received. So you can see that the subject was dynamically changed to the state that we processed. We finished processing Hawaii today at this time, and it was successful. So that brings us to the end of our demonstration. For one final tip, we want to really emphasize the importance of the log a message action, because this is your best friend when authoring with keys. In FME Desktop, feature caching makes workspace authoring incredibly easy since you can view your data at any transformer. We unfortunately don't have that level of functionality in automations, but the message logger is a nice substitute where you can check the values of keys as they pass through your automation. And keep in mind that you can still use the text editor here for custom key logging. So what next? If you want to jump into this, we highly recommend downloading the latest version of FME so that you can take advantage of the manual trigger and the split merge block, specifically because in 2021.1, that's when the split merge block was introduced. So we recommend downloading a free trial or upgrading to this version. And please check out additional resources on the community and download the project file for FME Server that contains the automation and the workspaces that we demonstrated in this webinar. That will be available afterwards. And then you can build your first automation based on what we've shown today using keys, and then you can take advantage of dynamic workflows. So in terms of important resources that we recommend you take a look at, we have a couple of articles for walking through the different types of keys that we use in automations, as well as different workflow designs through our job orchestration with automations article. Additionally, check out our blog for enterprise integration wins, and also check through our documentation on the keys, especially if you want help in understanding how these work and how to set them up. So thank you so much for joining us in this webinar. Please visit the link on the screen right now. I think we'll also be sharing in the chat, and please enter this code so that you can receive a badge on your community profile as a way of thanking you for attending this webinar. If you have ideas for improving FME, whether it be with server or with keys, we highly recommend posting these ideas on the community through our ideas section. A few ideas that we've seen that are directly relevant to keys include server-wide global keys, allowing date-time parameter values to be set in automation global keys, and much more. So definitely share your ideas with us. We really value your input because we always want to be improving the product, and maybe even one day you will see your own idea in the final product. And that brings us to our Q&A section. So feel free to submit any of your questions based on what we went through or any follow-up questions, and Holly and I and our QA team will do our best to answer your questions.
Yeah, we're having a few questions come in, so I just thought I'd turn my camera back on to answer some of those. One question that we got, which I thought was definitely worth highlighting, was why would one chain automation workspaces to pass on features? Couldn't the user simply condense those workspaces into one? And yes, they certainly could. So the reason that we might see users try and break out workspaces is if they have multiple engines on FME Server, then they can actually run those workspaces in parallel. So perhaps you have a workspace that takes an hour to process 1,000 features. And if you broke that down into 100 features, I'm going to get my math wrong, but that's 6 minutes per 100 features. And then you can run those workspaces all in parallel. So rather than taking an hour for processing, you can improve overall performance times by breaking out those features. So it won't work for all workspaces. It depends on the translation that you're doing and whether it can be divided out into smaller chunks for processing. Hopefully that makes sense. And probably on that same note, there is another question. Do the separate processes that get run have to run one at a time on an engine? So the answer is yes. Each FME Server engine can only run a single workspace at one time. So if you have multiple engines, then you'd be able to run multiple workspaces in parallel. However, if you only have a single engine, then they would all get submitted to a queue and simply run in sequence. So if you do only have one engine, then there wouldn't be the performance benefit of breaking your workspaces out into smaller chunks of processing.
We've got another great question. With the split merge block, if we want to attach a job log, will it attach all the job logs or just the last one? So I haven't tried this, but based on my understanding, Holly, you can confirm that it will attach just the final job log.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. So currently the split merge block doesn't merge all of the messages. So you won't be able to fetch the event keys from every single job that's run. It only stores the very last one. So if you have a use case for storing all of the messages or event information from every single job run, then definitely please let us know, because we do have we've had conversations internally about whether this is something that might be useful and is perhaps something that we could look at implementing. So post an idea or share your feedback in the chat, and we can pass that on to our product managers as well. Okay. So another one of the questions is, can you specify the FME engines to use in automations? So you absolutely can, and you would do that by use of queues. So I think we have a webinar on queues. I'll see if I can find it. But essentially through queues, you can assign engines, and then within the automation action, there's an option to set the queue. So let me just see if I can pull up FME Server and I can just show you where that is. I'll just share my screen again quickly. Yeah, so if I go into my demo and into my run workspace, then there's a section advanced, and here you have a job queue. So usually you'll have just a default job queue where all of the engines are assigned, but you can define your own queues as well. Okay, any other questions you wanted to answer, Mark? I think we still have time.
Let's see. You caught the main ones that I was looking at. I guess I'll scroll through them, take a look.
And I will just note while you're doing that, Mark, if anyone does have any questions come up after the webinar, definitely chat with us on the community. And then we also have the live chat on safe.com as well.
Let's see. This may be one that you may be more familiar with, Holly, but regarding email notifications, is there much flexibility to say read an XML and email as per configuration?
Is that XML in the attachment or the email body is XML?
Yeah, that would be good to clarify. But yeah, for sure, when it comes to customizing the contents of your emails, we do provide more than just text. You can set the format. So we include, I know, HTML and text. For XML, maybe you can add an email to the automation, just we can double check if that's available.
Yeah.
Holly, do you want to try that right now with the email action and just see and demonstrate what formats we support?
Yeah, I think it's just HTML, but let me just pause my screen, or unpause my screen, I should say. So if we add in our email action, then yeah, we have our email format, and it can either be plain text or HTML or rich text. I think that might be a new option. I'm actually not sure what rich text refers to. Perhaps Markdown or something like that.
Yeah, I haven't used that myself either.
No, I think probably you would be safer attaching the XML in a file in the email attachment. Okay, so another good question actually is that with the split merge block, if multiple events are sent into the block, will a single output be generated or an output per input event? That's a really good question that we can just reiterate. If I can find, yeah, the full demo. So basically, your split merge block will input however many or output however many features were input into it. So in this case, we wrapped the split merge block around all of our workspaces. So we have a single input from the manual trigger, which means that we're going to have a single output. However, if I move the split merge block so that it only contained the county, like this, then what would happen is I would have 5 input features from my state of Hawaii, which would mean that I would then have 5 output features on the other side. So you can choose what information is within your split merge block, and that will determine how many output features are being sent. So whatever goes in is what comes out on the other side.
And just if you're wondering, yes, it is possible to do nested blocks if you want to get into really complex automations, but we highly recommend reading through the job orchestration with automations article, because we dive into using the split merge block and just creating those really complex workflows and really explaining how everything works.
Okay, so another one is, can we run an automation manually from an FME Server app? So you certainly could. The manual trigger has a REST API endpoint. So in your server app workspace, you'd need to have an HTTP caller transformer that's submitting to that manual trigger REST API endpoint. Yeah, and I think that is, I don't know specific details, but I think there is work ongoing to try and integrate server apps and automations a little bit more, but it is definitely already possible.
Let's see, so a follow-up for that email question from earlier is that that is sending to different email addresses based on the workspace output, and the XML is the input file.
Oh, okay. Yes, so basically what you would have is the automation writer, and then that would contain an attribute that holds your email address, and then you'd set the automation writer key to the email to field in your email action. Okay, another really good question. We are going away from keys, so obviously please don't, you don't have to stick around. Thank you everyone if you did stay up until this point, but we're just kind of answering questions about automations in general, so I thought I should probably just mention that. So one of the questions that we've had is, can automations be rerun a few times if there is a failure before sending before sending a notification? So yes, you can do that, and I'll just demonstrate on screen again. So in your Run Workspace actions, you have this retry tab, and this allows you to retry a workspace on failure. And you can set the number of attempts that you'd like to retry, as well as the time to wait between attempts. So this can be really helpful if you're connecting to a database and you have intermittent network issues. Then you could perhaps say wait 60 seconds before you attempt to run again. And then a failure message will only be sent out of the failure port after all the retry attempts have failed, or if it's successful after one of those attempts, then it would send it out of the success port instead. So we have the retry option, and then, oh, sorry, Mark.
Oh, I guess I can talk about it after. Yeah, just continue.
Oh, no, I was just going to say the retry action is also available on the external actions. So if there's failure by an email. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is we do have the option to enable looping as well. So this is a little bit different, and a bit more care needs to be taken so that you don't create an infinite loop. But if you were to enable that, you could also connect either the failure or the success port back to any other kind of input port upstream within your automation as well.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to mention. So with looping, there are many different use cases, and like, let's say you had an improper input that failed in the workspace, then what you could do is with that loop, you can route the failure back to, let's say, a different workspace that revalidates your works, like the input, and it could try to fix it and then send that back into the input.
Okay, I think the questions are dying down now. We do still have another couple of minutes if you do want to squeeze any last questions in about keys or just automations in general. Just had a quick question about looping and whether it's a new feature. I think looping has been in since 2020. I'd have to double check that. I do think we have some good materials on the looping functionality. So let me just see if I can find those.
Yeah, looping hasn't been a very obvious feature because we do keep it in the menu. So you will have to enable it before you can start using that in your automations. But yeah, definitely make the most out of it.
Yeah, and so just have a look. It was available since 2020.0, and I did just share an article on looping. Looping was around before the retry, and I would definitely say that if you simply want to resubmit a workspace on failure, then it would be better to configure the retry option so that you don't create that infinite loop scenario. Okay, so next question is there a beginner tutorial on event keys? Yes, let me just check if that resource was already shared. And I can share it again. There is a nice tutorial on all the different output keys. So it does address event keys as well as the other key types. And that would be a good one to follow along with if you'd like more guidance. So I just shared that one in the chat as well. And I think there is a project file. And again, for this webinar, along with the recording, we will be sharing the slide deck, which has the links to all of the resources and the ideas. And we'll also be sharing a project file. So if you're new to FME Server, then we have a concept called projects, which allows you to import existing items. So we can provide you with this project file, and then you can actually upload the automation that we demonstrated today and have a look, run it yourself, and understand it as well. So definitely, if you're ready to get started with automations and keys, then taking a closer look at that project would be a really good starting point.
And just to mention, projects, they are often version dependent. So since we are working with the split merge block, which was introduced in 2021.1, this project will be limited to be importing into FME Server 2021.1. So
yes, good point.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, we're bang on the hour now. So I think probably Liz will leave the question panel open for maybe another couple of minutes. And if you do have any further questions, then we can try and follow up with you after the webinar. But we hope this was helpful. So thank you so much for joining us. Mark, if you have any final words before we say goodbye.
No, that's it. Just thank you very much for joining us today and spending the time to learn about automations and keys. And we really hope that you can take really valuable lessons away from what we went through today. And yeah, definitely come to us if you need help or post on the community for ideas. And yeah, thank you so much again.
Yeah. Okay, thank you guys. Bye for now.
Bye.
Thanks everyone. Bye.